The Wasp Factory. Chapter 9. What happened to Eric? Part 2. In fact, Eric appeared to recover from what happened. He was sedated. He spent a couple of nights in the hospital as a patient, then a few days resting in his room at the residence. He went back to his studies within a week and attended class as normal. A few people knew something had happened and they saw that Eric was quieter, but that was all. My father and I didn't know anything except that he had been off from his classes for a short while because of a migraine. Later we heard Eric started drinking a lot, missing classes, turning up in the wrong one, shouting in his sleep, waking other people on his floor of the residence, taking drugs, missing exams and practical classes. In the end, the university had to suggest he took the rest of the year off because he had missed so much work. Eric took it badly. He got all his books and piled them up in the corridor outside his tutor's room and set light to them. He was lucky they didn't prosecute him, but the university authorities took a latent view of the smoke and the slight damage to their ancient wood paneling, and Eric came back to the island. But not for me. He refused to have anything to do with me, and he kept himself locked in his room, listening to his records very loudly, and hardly ever going out except to the town, where he was quickly banned from all 4 pubs from starting fights and shouting and swearing at people. When he did notice me, he would stare at me with his huge eyes, or tap his nose and wink slyly. His eyes had grown dark set and were underlined with bags, and his nose seemed to twitch a lot. Once he picked me up and gave me a kiss on the lips, which really made me frightened. My father grew almost uncommunicative as Eric. He settled into a morose existence and long walks and dour introspective silences. He started smoking cigarettes, virtually chain smoking for a while. For a month or so, the house was held to be in, and I went out a lot or stayed in my room and watched television. Then Eric took two frighteningly small boys from the town, first by throwing worms at them, then by stuffing worms down their shirts as they came back from school. Some of the parents and teachers and Diggs came to the island to see my father once Eric started trying to force the kids to eat the worms and handfuls of maggots. I sat sweating in my room while they met in the lounge underneath, the parents shouting at my father. Eric was talked to by the doctor, by Diggs, even by a social worker from Iverness, but he didn't say much. He just sat smiling and sometimes mentioning how much protein there was in worms. Once he came back to the house, all battered and bleeding, my father and I assumed some of the bigger boys or a few of the parents had caught him and beaten him. Apparently, dogs had been disappearing from the town for a couple of weeks before some children saw my brother pouring a can of petrol over a little Yorkshire Terrier and setting fire to it. Their parents believed them when they went looking for Eric to find him doing the same thing with an old mongrel he had tempted with aniseed balls, sweeties, and caught. They chased him through the woods and behind the town, but lost him. Diggs came to the island again that evening to tell us he had come to arrest Eric for disturbing the peace. He waited until quite late, only accepting a couple of the whiskeys my father offered him, but Eric did not return. Diggs left and my father waited up, but still Eric didn't show. It was 3 days and 5 dogs later before he came back, haggard and unwashed and smelling of petrol and smoke, his clothes all torn and his face lean and filthy. My father heard him come in early and in the morning, raid the fridge, gulp down several meals at once, and stamp upstairs to bed. My father crept down to the phone and called Diggs, who arrived before breakfast. Eric must have heard or seen something, though, because he went out through his room window and down the drain pipe to the ground and made off with Diggs' bike. It was another week and 2 more dogs before he was finally caught, siphoning petrol from somebody's car in the street. They broke his jaw in the process of making their citizen's arrest, and this time Eric didn't get away. A few months later, he was certified insane. He had had all sorts of tests, tried to escape countless times, assaulted male nurses and social workers and doctors, and threatened all of them with legal action and assassination. He was moved to gradually more and more long-term and secure institutions as his tests and threats and struggles continued. My father and I heard that he quieted down a lot once he settled into the hospital to the south of Glasgow and no longer made his escape attempts. But looking back, he was probably just trying successfully, it would seem, to lull his keepers into a false sense of security, and now he was making his way back to see us. I swept my binoculars slowly across the land in front and beneath me, from north to south, from haze to haze, across the town and the roads and the railway and the fields and the sands, and I wondered if under my gaze at any point came the place where Eric was now. If he had got this far already. I felt he was close. I didn't have any good reason, but he had the time. The call of last night sounded clearer and the others he had made, clearer than the others he had made, and I just felt it. He might be here now, lying up waiting for night before he moved, or skulking through the woods, or through the wind bushes, or within the hollows of the dunes, heading for the house or looking for dogs. I walked along the ridge of hills, came down a few miles south of town, down through the ranks and conifers, where distant buzzsaws sounded and dark masses of trees were shady and quiet. I went across the railway line and over a few fields of swaying barley, across the road and over the rough sheep pasture to the sands. My feet were sore, my legs ached slightly as I walked along the line of hard sand on the beach. A slight wind had come up off the sea, and I was glad of it, because the clouds had all gone, and the sun, though sinking gradually, was still powerful. I came to a river I had already crossed once in the hills, and crossed it again near the sea, going up into the dunes away to where I knew there was a wire bridge. Sheep scattered in front of me, some shorn, some still shaggy, bouncing away with their fractured sounding baths, then stopping once they thought they were safe and dipping their heads or kneeling to resume cropping the flower-scattered grass. I remember I used to despise sheep for being so profoundly stupid. I'd seen them eat and eat. I'd seen them eat and eat and eat. I'd watched, I'd eat them. I'd watch dogs outsmart whole flocks of them. I chased them and laughed at the way they ran, watched them get themselves into all sorts of stupid, tangled situations, and I thought they quite deserved to end up as mutton. And that being used to wool making machines was too good for them. It was years and a long, slow process before I eventually realized just what sheep really represented. Not their own stupidity, but our power, our avarice, and egotism. After I'd come to understand evolution and know a little about history and farming, I saw that the thick white animals I'd laughed at for following each other around and getting caught in bushes were the product of generations of farmers as much as generations of sheep. We made them. We molded them from the wild, smart survivors that were their ancestors so that they would become docile, frightened, stupid, tasty wool producers. We didn't want them to be smart, and to some extent, their aggression and their intelligence went together. Of course, the rams are brighter, but even they are demeaned by the idiotic females they have to associate with and inseminate. The same principle applies to chickens and cows and almost anything we've been able to get our greedy, hungry hands on for long enough. It occasionally occurs to me that that something the same might have It occasionally occurs to me that something the same might have happened to women, but attractive though the theory might be, I suspect I'm wrong. Home in time for dinner, wolfed down my eggs, steak, chips, and beans, and spent the rest of the evening watching television and picking bits of dead cow out of my mouth with a match.